Today we read chapter 3, Atlantic Africa. All of this time we have been basically doing a prelude to colonial Latin America, these three civilizational areas that would come together. And as Restall and Lane note, in fact, many Latin American and US textbooks do not include material about Africa before the trade of this transatlantic slave trade. And so I think this is a very good thing that they did, of put a whole chapter here about what was happening in Africa beforehand, starting out with this guy. Who's this guy, Ryan? Mansa Musa. Wow, that was fast. Quick off the, yeah, you should know this guy. The richest man in the world of his times. And some people say, I'm not sure how they exactly calculate, but he was the richest man of all time. All the physical wealth. All right, there we go. The gold, he was the gold standard. In fact, as Ryan, you pointed out, he was spending so much gold that what happened? Yeah, I just went in and spent a bunch of gold, and then all of a sudden the currency got devalued because you're spending all that. That's the problem with being on a gold standard. If somebody comes in with a bunch of it, your currency gets all messed up, which happens later in the Americas too with the silver, because they add a bunch of silver in, again, gets messed up. But yeah, I think it's some calculation based on sort of total wealth in the world and how this person had control over it. But yeah, always good to start out with a person like that. To show us what? To show us that, in fact, the Europeans, in late medieval times, were much more fascinated by the gold of Africa than anything else. And they were really after that. They really wanted that. And we have this idea, I think we see it in the movies and stuff, the Spaniards in the Americas, and they're always wanting gold. I mean, it probably was actually more rooted in the Africa experience. They didn't find lots of gold in the Americas, but they certainly wanted to. Just, a little outline of the thing is there were all these great, interesting empires, kingdoms in Africa. Restall and Lane said there wasn't any single empire that ruled millions of subjects like the Inca or the Aztec. And we talked about this before, that there were more like competing zones or competing kingdoms that would go back and forth and overrun each other. And so both in Africa and in Eurasia, there was a kind of an arms race. So you'd be trying to develop weapons and an army in a way that the Inca and Aztec, although they were obviously had huge military presence in their respective continents, they didn't really compete with anyone else. They absorbed all the little places. So here we have these very, people who had explored, settled, traded with each other within Africa. I was thinking about this when in my childhood, I had this terrible game that we played. It was called The Exploration of Africa, and it just depicted Africa as this blank map. And you'd take your little piece and you'd explore and you'd draw these cards, and then with a crayon, basically, you'd draw in things as you went along, but it was based on nothing. It was like it could be different every time. And then at the end of the game, you just erase the whole map and you could start over. It was like Africa was just this blank interior, which is a terrible way to think about things. And we shouldn't do it that way, because it was, in fact, a very populated and well-known interior. But this leads us to, well, nobody asked this question except me, which is, why aren't we studying? This class is called Colonial Latin America, right? Why aren't we studying Latin Africa? You know what I mean? Because remember, they're coming down from the Reconquista. They want the African gold. They're really interested in more land and stuff. Why didn't they just expand into all of Africa? At the time, it was right there. they were trying, don't get me wrong, they were trying, but there's a reason, there's a number of reasons why this place did not become Latin Africa and was only colonized until later. So one of the reasons that we just learned about is there were actually very rich and powerful kingdoms in Africa. They had access to resources, access to gold, access to stuff. They were able to sort of keep the Europeans at bay. They were also very experienced in agriculture and farming and crops and stuff like that. And so they had an extensive experience in throughout, not the whole continent, of course. The Congo Basin is still to this day famously a very important place for hunting and gathering, but there was sort of a rich agricultural experience. They were also good at something else. Yeah, some people believe that many parts of the cowboy tradition in the West were actually imported from Africa and developed in those parts of the world. So they became important. They were animal herders in many parts of Africa, and that was an important skill that was also brought into the New World. Pluto, you like this sentence that many historians talk about, the land of the blacksmith kings. Why? No memory of the land of the blacksmith kings. Why is it important to remember and always talk about blacksmiths? What does that indicate? If we have this place in Africa, which is known, at least by the historians, as the land of the blacksmith kings, it indicates that all sorts of things are going on there. There's mining, metalworking, what we call metallurgy. And so they're skilled in iron, copper, gold. More, you know, in the Americas, they were skilled at gold and mining of various sorts, but they really didn't have the iron and the copper stuff. And so already in Africa, you see that they are in the land of the blacksmith kings, or at least parts of it. It's not the whole continent, but you know, different parts of this. Now, this is hugely important to our world today, and I'm going to just keep saying blacksmith over and over until it sticks in your head. You may have heard about the blacksmiths a little bit ago. So what the hugely important part, because it comes to us from the end of the chapter, they kind of tie this all together, is that the Europeans, when they were enslaving Africans, they were actually drawing upon their skills, like animal herding, like agriculture, like planting, you know, rice in the U.S. South. And so they were bringing skills and valued for those skills into the Americas. Now, I keep saying blacksmith because not too long ago, in fact, last year, a presidential candidate defended the Florida curriculum because he said that, in fact, Black people benefited from slavery. You could learn to be a blacksmith. Now, like I said, I don't know why blacksmith keeps coming up, but just last year, DeSantis was claiming that, oh, you could learn to be a blacksmith in slavery. I mean, it's actually sad because, in fact, like I said, people were in the land of the blacksmith kings, bringing those skills into the Americas, probably teaching people here to do it. And now, you know, so I don't want to pick on DeSantis too. Well, I do want to, but I'm not going to because was a common part of the US school curriculum. The idea that somehow slavery was an institution that helped, it was like school. It helped people develop skills. It helped these uncivilized people develop skills, when in fact it was perhaps the other way around. So anyway, I find it interesting that we have so much about blacksmiths in this chapter, and in fact, it still comes up today.
And it's intentionally ignorant for that reason.
It's intentionally ignorant for that reason. I think I'll just agree with that. Yes, but the other thing, the other factor in why that Josie mentioned, and why we don't talk about why Africa was not, the interior of Africa was not super colonized until very late, was because of malaria and resistance to malaria. So malaria is a tropical agriculture disease that sort of follows where people irrigate in certain ways in the tropics, of course, mosquito-borne. It's a terrible and very debilitating or deadly disease. And there is an adaptation to it, a resistance to it, but it's primarily through what we call the sickle cell trait or HBS alleles. And those people who live in malarial areas over time have evolved this resistance. But the sickle cell trait is a very cruel way to evolve resistance. It's a recessive gene. And if you are, so, you remember those Punnett squares in evolution? If you have it as a recessive trait, then you do have resistance to malaria. You're not immune, but it's pretty strong. However, if you are unfortunate enough to get two copies of it, two doubles of the recessive, the sickle cell trait is, this sickle cell disease, as you may know, is very terrible and often deadly. So, it's like, if you are in this place, if you are recessive for the trait, then that's great. But if you have the double recessive copy, it's almost like having a quarter of your children being really in trouble. It's a terrible evolutionary trade-off, and it's still with us today. I mean, you may have known in the United States, they're still looking for ways to treat it because, people still end up combining it in different ways. In the United States, we often see sickle cell trait as a racial trait. So it's commonest among African Americans because of where people were brought from in the transatlantic slave trade. And so we see it as a marker for being Black. Sickle cell trait does not exist, as you can see, in all of Africa, right? So it is, there's plenty of places where it doesn't exist. It also exists in parts of India and parts of Saudi Arabia. We just don't see those people for the most part in the United States. So we tag it as a racial trait when in fact it is not a racial trait. It can be in these places and in a little bit in Greece and Crete too. So places where malaria is. Like I said, it's an evolutionary adaptation, but it's a pretty cruel one, and it gives us a sense of how these things work. But it's not a racial trait, but it did limit European, as you can see, these Europeans didn't have it, and so they couldn't come into and sort of travel in. They couldn't invade Africa very far because they didn't have resistance to malaria. Now, as we'll see in the very next chapter, what they did have resistance to were things like smallpox, and that is what the indigenous Americans did not have resistance to. And so the vector of disease sort of went the other way. So for Europeans who were trying to invade Africa, they were limited by the vector of malaria. When they were invading the Americas, they were helped, you might say, by the vector of smallpox and some other infectious diseases. Does that make sense? All right. So those are the reasons. Now, I should say, James, when did they figure out what to do about malaria? They developed quinine. I don't know if this is ironic, but out of the Andes, quinine was derived from the Americas. And then they were able to use that to.
Isn't that in a drink or something? Like it's in like tonic water or something?
Let's see. I think they did used to use it in that. I mean, I think that now we take it in pill form.
Yeah.
They may have added it. That may have been a form. I'm trying to think if that rings a bell, although I might be thinking of something else. But yeah, you might be right. Anyway, that was the miracle, the so-called miracle drug that allowed the actual colonization of Africa, which you may have read about in your other history classes about, you know, when they all basically a scramble for Africa in the 1870s, 1880s and there. But again, it's because they developed quinine out of Andean American sources. They were able to then basically colonize Africa. So as we talked about in the last class, this was, you know, the Portuguese were the ones from the Iberian Peninsula sailing down the west coast of Africa. They basically, because they couldn't go too far inland, they set up these stations on the coast. The Portuguese Empire was extensive, but it consisted of a lot of trading posts. They weren't as kind of land, you know, they liked having land too, but they were a trading nation already. They were and we'll read a little bit more about Lisbon in the next chapter, but they set up these trading posts. Yes, and that was important because they didn't have direct access to that, but they were also wanting to make them into Catholics and convert them, right? And so there were missions and baptisms and conversions into capitalist Catholics, you might say. So, you know, I mean, again, as Restall and Lane point out, there were centuries of sustained and invasive Portuguese activity in Africa. So it wasn't like they weren't trying. They were trying, but they were limited either by, you know, resistance from Africans to further encroachment, the kind of resources that Africans had to resist, and also the malaria and the fact that then the other Africans would form and mixed peoples would form the role of intermediaries. And so we have this shift where we go from basically you have this, you know, trying to get gold and trying to get resources to starting to, or, you know, to trade in enslaved persons. And so trying to own people and take them to other places, which is what is known as chattel slavery. So chattel slavery basically means, this was Ryan's question, basically means, you know, the form of slavery in which someone is personal property and can be bought and sold. You know, I mean, I think that in the extreme form, then the children can also be bought and sold, but there were some places in which that was more limited than others. And so, Ryan, you had this quote, you quoted this part, which was, as a result of the transatlantic trade, the concept of chattel slavery was ancient in Africa. And you said this was a little bit confusing because it's that as a result part. And the reason it's confusing is, well, sometimes you need the whole quote. If you do the whole quote and go back a little bit from there, it becomes less confusing. And maybe they could have written this better. Although its scope and volume grew tremendously as a result of the transatlantic trade. So the scope and volume is what's growing as a result of the transatlantic trade. The concept of chattel slavery was ancient in Africa. It wasn't like they did, this was already a practice that existed. What's the other point, Noah? What do they start to do here with this trade? So you have this cultural practice that pre-exists the Portuguese. What do the Portuguese do with it? Does it grow or does it shrink? grows. In fact, James, I think you said it was exponential
Yeah.
growth. I mean, enormously grows.
Especially if you look at.
This is sort of industrial scale. I think Noah quoted factories, right? This is taking something that was kind of, I mean, it's not, you don't want to excuse something, but it was more of a, you know, it was more of a cultural practice which was intermittent. It was done to making it an industry, to making it something that was like, that was basically what was being done here. Yeah, good discussion. They mentioned that, you know, what happened is that this probably the first sugar plantations were on these little islands off the coast of Africa here, which get these Portuguese names. Now, these two islands were uninhabited before the Portuguese showed up, São Tomé and Príncipe. And basically, this was the place they started growing sugar. They started importing enslaved Africans to grow it here. And it looks like this probably was the template or the roots for what would later be used in Brazil and in the Caribbean. So you can see here, again, you can see how the Portuguese are coming down the coast and setting up these coastal areas that you know, they're not getting too far inland, but they're setting up a lot of different trading posts throughout Africa at this time, and some of our first sugar plantations. Archaeologists have actually been, you know, looking at some of these first plantations on Sao Tome, the 16th century sugar mill. So this is the tropical plantation system, which would go on to shape the Atlantic world at a terrible human cost. So that, again, this is kind of the first little bits of it. As we'll read in the next chapter, this also is part of the history of the Canary Islands, to the extent that then, as Reston and Lane point out, slavery would become central. We talked about how slavery became central to the Iberian Peninsula economy but that could be done with a relatively small number of people. So this map gives you a sense of, you know, greatest volume, visual representative of greatest volume of people taken from different places, and also where they went. And, you know, probably about 40% of this trade went into Brazil. And probably another 40 to 50% went into the Caribbean. As we'll see, most of that was to do sugar, for sugar plantations. What's missing from this? What one of today's American countries is a relatively small player in this trade? Oh, that was a badly phrased question. Notice that North America, the United States, gets only a very small percentage of the enslaved people. It's, you know, I don't know, I'm going to say 5% of the total. And so, you know, I mean, and we in the United States associate enslavement, I think, a lot stereotypically with cotton, but that wasn't the big driver of the slave trade. No, it's yeah, it's later. Now there were others that got moved from the Caribbean later into the United States, so that wasn't the sole source, but yeah, James.
It was the Carolinas and Virginia, right, that did it, used for rice and for tobacco.
Right, yeah. Also, you know, it later on into, of course, Mississippi and
other southern places.
yeah. And in the North, let's not, you know, I mean, there were also slaves in Boston and New York City, and actually New York City was, for those of you who read How the Word is Passed last semester, New York City was once the site of the second largest slave market in the United States. And pretty large African presence. One of the other interesting differences, and interesting is a funny word that's discussed in the how the word is passed by Clint Smith, is that in the United States, they actually, the enslaved population increased because, I mean, I hate to say this, but they were basically bred and then sold as children along the way. And so it's one of the few places, most of the people who were imported into the Caribbean and Brazil to work on sugar plantations, it was very deadly work. The average survival rate was something like 7 years working on a sugar plantation. And so there were a lot of enslaved people, and there was a large population that maintained itself. But the United States is perhaps one of the only slave societies in the world in which the population grows without, and it grows because they're like deliberately increasing the population, you know, like I said, basically breeding and selling children off as they're being as they're being born into the system. So it's a particularly, you know, the United States did this in a strange way. The other, I guess I will also mention that, you know, the other non-Latin American places that got a lot of enslaved Africans were, of course, Jamaica and Barbados. So, I mean, the English were not absent from this trade by any means. All right. So I think at the end of this chapter, on page 48, I think I keep reading page 48 over and over again because it's, you know, it's an important page. It brings together a lot of the last few paragraphs. So it talks about the first sugar plantations on San Tome off the coast of Africa. It talks about the skills of the Africans, metallurgy, and, you know, African skills were taken across the Atlantic along with belief systems, languages, musical styles, and many other traits, all to be rearranged, blended, and even reinvented in the new world of the Americas. So everything from guitars and the blues tradition, without it, wouldn't have anything like rock and roll. So, you know, that's all very important. And then they ask this question: why, we might ask, were so many Africans sent along this transatlantic way of death by fellow Africans? And it says the answer may be in part quite simple. Just as before the arrival of the Spanish in the Western Hemisphere, the category of Indians had no local meaning, before the arrival of the Portuguese, there was no such category in Africa as Africans, much less blacks. So what they're saying there, I think, Pluto, this is one of your questions, is that in Africa, it wasn't like there was a continental identity. They didn't see themselves as belonging to sort of Africans, and they didn't see themselves as belonging to a, you know, what we would consider to be a racial category. The category of black would have made no sense. So they say these racial identities made no sense among ethnically, religiously, and politically diverse peoples engaged in their own internal and regional endeavors. So there were certainly group identities. People had different languages, religions. They had different occupations, different styles of doing things. We might say cultures, ethnicities. And they also traded with each other and migrated and explored their continents and beyond. And people traveled, spent money, were rich. All those things happened. But what there was not was this sort of continent-wide identity, sort of the identities that we think about today as European and African and Indigenous or Native American as racial identities. Those simply, it's not, again, it's not that people didn't look at each other and talk about physical differences, but this was not sort of an overarching category that we would lump people into. And so as I talked about on the first class, what happened in the Americas is crucial to our whole idea about that people come in these overarching large groups, which are basically equivalent to whole continents. And their sentence here is their very last sentence is especially crucial. Racism would prove useful only to those who stood to benefit politically or materially from European overseas expansion. So as Clint Smith also says in How the Word is Passed, it's not like race precedes racism. We often think that people of different races are then racist to each other. It's in fact that racism creates the category of race. You see what I'm saying? It's a useful thing to sort people into if you are benefiting from the plantation system. If you are benefiting from that, racism, the sorting of people into these groups and then putting them in certain slots, is what creates this whole category or identification of race. So it wasn't like there was a bunch of scientists going out there and identifying groups and then, oh, the groups are like, oh yeah, we don't like each other. No, it's a racist system from the beginning that then creates and perpetuates these identities.